Hello and welcome to Life Beyond the Numbers, the podcast for people who are curious about how to have a more fulfilling work life. We live in a world largely driven by numbers, logic and reason. But how we feel at work and about our work impacts us, our organisations and society. There is a relationship between the numbers of our organisations and the life beyond the numbers. I'm Susan Chríodáin, your host. I've lived and worked in many countries. I've met people who love what they do and people who don't, people who bring their full selves to work and people who won't. But one thing that I've learned that is common to us all is that we are all unique and have unique experiences. And it's helpful to know that there are others who think like we do, or have had struggles too, or have gone where we want to go, or can show us things we didn't know. So join me and my guests as we place a lens on the human side of work life by sharing insights, stories and strategies to inspire you to let your uniqueness shine through. Welcome to episode 179 of Life Beyond the Numbers. This episode is going out on Saturday, June 22nd, 2024, which is the fourth Saturday in June. And that means it is a solo episode. I hope you enjoyed the episodes that went out earlier this month, the beginning of the month. We had Trust with Kevin Chevis. I just loved that conversation and how, well, the humility that Kevin showed during our conversation really stayed with me well after the conversation and editing it as well. The next episode was with Dan Whyte, all about sleep, and I am a very big advocate for sleep and proper sleep. So it was just really cool to get into some of the research around sleep and also things that we can do for ourselves to help ourselves sleep better. And then last week was a wonderful episode with Alison Smith, all about metaphors and using nature as a help to come up with metaphors. There was a lot of fun in that episode. Yeah, we had a lot of laughter. If you haven't listened to them, they're all worth listening to and all come with a different perspective on life and work life, which is what this podcast is all about. And the podcast hit 10,000 downloads in the last week. Woohoo! That is since we started in September 2020. So thank you for listening. Keep on listening and tell your friends. Now, this episode is not going to be about my book, Leading Beyond the Numbers, How Accounting for Emotions But Tips the Balance at Work, came out in mid-May. And it is selling because the publisher just did the first reprint, which is fantastic news. I'm really happy about that, and I'd love to hear from you if you've read it and kindly leave a review somewhere. This week I was on a conversation with a global group, and this is a regular get together on Zoom. I don't always make it because it's one of those that you drop in when you can. And interestingly, this week the topic was compassion and self-compassion. And it got me thinking a lot about compassion and self-compassion, because most people on the call spent a couple of minutes talking about compassion and how it shows up and what it means to them. And what struck me most about that was that many of us said that we had never been thought about compassion. We weren't taught to be self-compassionate. We weren't perhaps taught about compassion either. And we talked about how we became aware of what compassion was, and that it's something that you actively have to cultivate in your life. Which made me think, well, do you know what compassion is and what self-compassion is? Often the words that we use that are pervasive in our society, we might not really understand exactly what they mean. We have a good idea, you recognise it. We have a general understanding of the concept, but do we really connect with its meaning? Do we feel it deep inside? And there's a difference. And I think that's what came up in the conversation. There was that experiential understanding, that lived experience of compassion, rather than having a cognitive understanding of what compassion or self-compassion is only. So I thought I would just break down compassion a little bit, and got help from people to do that. Other than that conversation, I had a look at what David Whyte, what Dr. Kristin Neff says about compassion, and consulted with a couple of other books that I have as well. The word compassion comes from the Latin word compati, which means to suffer with. But actually, now compassion is understood more as being sensitive to the suffering of self and others, with a commitment to try to prevent it and relieve it. And that has to have two parts. So firstly, we need to be open and receptive to suffering in ourselves and in others. We need to be able to move towards that, not away from it. So accepting the suffering, and then knowing how to respond to suffering in ourselves and in others. And of course, most of us are absolutely capable of sensing that somebody is suffering. And we may feel an urge to alleviate that, almost like a gut instinct or a gut response. You can feel it bubbling up inside that you want to take action, you want to do something. But sometimes something stops us from taking any action. You might wonder, can I do something more to help? Am I going to offend this person if I try to help them? Or will I pressurize them into doing something? Maybe they'll take advantage of me. So at times we can feel a little bit at odds at whether or not we can take some action to alleviate and respond to their suffering. And of course, the same to ourselves, but we'll come to that one a bit later. Compassion involves us understanding and accepting suffering, but not just sitting in it, like wallowing in it, or believing that we shouldn't do something about it. Actually, the acceptance is an act of courage that calls for wisdom in our action. You've probably felt compassion for a family member or a close friend when they were suffering. So to do that, the first thing was you had to notice that the family member or friend was struggling or not feeling the best about themselves. That is the experience of compassion. And if that is what you felt, compassion and not pity or sympathy or empathy, you realize that the suffering and the failure or the imperfection is just part of who we are. It's what humans have in common. It's part of our shared humanity. And then when you realize that, you can respond with warmth, understanding, and kindness. You have a sense of tolerance or patience for what's happening, and you're not judging. And in the book of Human Emotions, there's reference to a former nurse, Mandy Reichwald, who says that true compassion is about supporting people so they can find their own strength. She warns against the instinct to rush in, to throw your arms around a person, to comfort them, as this takes away their ability to prepare themselves for the situation. And she said instead to listen, be interested, be still. It's not about you, it's about them. She does suggest that saying, I feel really shocked by what you've said, I need to take a minute, or that's so sad, can have a surprising effect. It's when we feel most overcome that we might retreat to the safety of pity, tilting our heads and keeping people at a distance almost. But actually, honesty counters that. And even ringing someone up and saying, I just don't know what to say, but I wanted to see how things are, is so much better than avoiding them altogether. Of course, if you're going to be overwhelmed by another's problems, you won't be able to help. So you need to recognize that too, and you need to take care of yourself first. And it's that old adage, isn't it? Put your own oxygen mask on before helping anyone else put on theirs. So compassion requires strength and courage. And then what of self-compassion? Well, Dr. Kristin Neff, who studies compassion, says that having compassion for yourself is really no different than having compassion for others. With self-compassion, we give ourselves the same kindness and understanding and support that we'd give to a good friend when they're struggling or feeling bad. We need to be kind and understanding and forgiving and tolerant towards ourselves when we're suffering or we fail at something or we feel just basically inadequate, rather than ignoring it or punishing ourselves with self-criticism. So instead of adapting the stiff upper lip, keep calm and carry on mentality, or allowing your thoughts to take you in an unwanted direction, pause and admit to yourself, tell yourself, this is a bit crap right now, or this is really difficult right now. How can I take care of myself? What do I need now? And when we step outside of our situation and treat ourselves like a friend, we might look at it, the situation differently and put it into a different perspective. We tend to default to self-criticism and judgment and so on, when actually just taking a moment and a breath and a pause and saying, well, would I tell a friend that? No, you probably wouldn't. So then why would you say that to yourself? And of course, you have to recognize what's going on inside of yourself. And if you're avoiding or resisting or suppressing what's going on inside you, then you won't have the chance of understanding your mind or being compassionate towards yourself. It's not possible to develop deeper levels of compassion coming towards you if you are resisting developing self-compassion. And then what I find so fascinating as well, what I read, is if there are things in you that you block or detest, you'll actually struggle to empathize with similar things in others. So if you don't like to see people taking time off because you don't do it, you won't really ever understand why other people do it. If you don't understand why people say no when you think they should say yes because you would say yes in that situation, you don't understand then that people have boundaries that protect them. And you're judging other people's choices in life by something you're harsh to yourself about. And so rather than actually examining your choice, you're basically making a judgment that everyone else has it wrong. Or it couldn't possibly be that bad. I think that's another way of looking at it. So when I think of what I went through with menopause, for example, I would have found that so hard to understand for other people if I hadn't gone through some of the things that I went through. I really, really would have struggled to understand how difficult things can get. And that's where compassion comes in. It's not about your experience and saying that everyone else's experience is the same. It's about listening to what that other person is going through, but also accepting what you're going through and that you're human. So instead of harshly judging and criticizing yourself, be kind and understanding, as no one is perfect and no one's expecting perfection. And if they are, yeah, okay. Now, something that amused me was I've heard David Whyte say that we're all slightly off the rails a lot of the time. And we have to realise that and have it as a basis of our compassion for ourselves, but also for others. So understanding that everyone is trying their very best, and sometimes that best is not very good at all, gives us a good compassionate perspective on the general state of humanity. We're just one person amongst all these other people. We're only human, imperfectly perfect in our inadequacies. But being able to tune into them and transform them and mature through them is growth. So basically, self-compassion is rooted in our common humanity and means you honour and accept your humanness. There's no need to feel alone. This default, I'm the only one going through something like this, this sense of isolation we can bring upon ourselves when we're suffering or having a painful experience, and whether that's just through our thinking or it's physical or emotional. Suffering is part of being human. We all experience loss. We all experience sorrow. We will all experience pain, frustration, anger, make mistakes, fall short of who you think you ought to be. That's just being human. It's common to all of us. And I think it's not just me thinking it, it's what the books say as well, but the more that you open up to that and recognize your fallibility, you can feel more compassion towards yourself and others. And so actually this shared humanity, this shared suffering. And it can be different levels. I'm not saying that all suffering is equal, but it's not about a competition here. It's about accepting that certain things cause angst and suffering and pain to people, and you can just listen and be there for them. The research shows that people who are more self-compassionate benefit in terms of their mental and physical health. They're more likely to feel happy, optimistic, satisfied with life, have a stable and unconditional sense of self-worth, be appreciative of and satisfied with their bodies, be conscientious and take personal responsibility, cope with work challenges and feel more competent and effective at their jobs, maintain healthy work-life balance, draw healthy boundaries and say no, sleep well, and have a strong immune system. And there are a whole host of other benefits to being self-compassionate. And often when we talk about things like that, people say, well, it's selfish. Actually, it's not. And the more compassion that flows into yourself, the more resources you will have available to others. It's not self-indulgent either, because self-indulgence is about getting short-term pleasure at the expense of long-term harm. When we care about ourselves, we're willing to undergo discomfort for our well-being. Or maybe you're just feeling sorry for yourself. Well, self-pity is about why me? And it's focused in on the self, while self-compassion frames the experience of imperfection in light of a shared human experience. So it's a wider focus, it's a different perception, a different lens. You can spend your life avoiding things that feel uncomfortable and feel difficult for you, or you can accept that these feelings are part of being human, and you can move through the world with greater ease by tuning into and being more aware of your brain and your body, your thoughts and feelings. Learning how to regulate your nervous system helps you to think differently about things, and especially things that cause us to react or trigger us. And when we react to situations, it is not about who we are, but about how we are responding. And when we're in a dysregulated state, we tend to be more self-critical and will assign blame. But when we're in a regulated state and our nervous system is regulated, we will be more compassionate and open. And then you can show up for the other human and focus on being compassionate towards them. And you can also be compassionate towards yourself. Show up for yourself and be understanding. According to Kristin Neff, the quintessential question of self-compassion is, what do I need right now? What do I need right now? What will alleviate this suffering, this pain, this discomfort? And of course, the answer will change according to the circumstances. But in choosing to cultivate self-compassion, we actually need to practice becoming that kind of person. It is important to us to think about what we want to become, who we want to become. It's not something we think about often. And we don't really think that we can deliberately practice to become a certain type of person. But we can. We just have to decide to do so. And then we put the time in to practice. So, do you ration your self-compassion? Do you ration your compassion for others, you could take a moment after this recording, which is about to end very shortly, and write down the qualities you'd imagine having if you became the most compassionate you at your very best. This will bring up the words that you already know deep down are involved in compassion, and they're what you work towards being. And if that's not for you, you can also go to Kristin Neff's website, and she has a self-compassionate survey you can take. There's over 20 questions you answer, and that will give you a score, and it will give you an idea of where your self-compassion is. And it's got some sub-scales in there: self-kindness, common humanity, mindfulness, self-judgment, isolation, and over-identification. And the other thing I found out while researching this episode is there is an International Self-Compassion Day, and it will fall on July 20th. So look out on that day, or maybe look in and be self-compassionate. Practice self-compassion. And it is a practice. It really is. It's something you need to remind yourself of time and time again. I know I do. And I know I go down the self-judgment route and the self-critical route. And I am consciously cultivating compassion towards myself. And I wish the same for you. So next week, because there's a 5th Saturday in June, there will be a compilation episode. And then we'll be back at the beginning of July with the next conversation. Thanks for listening. Bye. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed the paths we traversed on today's episode. If something rang through for you, be sure to let me know. Or maybe you can share this with someone in your life who would benefit from listening too. And if you enjoy helping others, I'd be so grateful if you would leave a review, so that people who might also be curious about their own life beyond the numbers can discover this podcast too.